Hey y'all, welcome to Thursday night Purpose Talk. How are y'all doing? I don't want that ring light to be shining off my glasses. Yeah, no. So, hello. Good evening. It is Thursday night. Um, Purpose Talk. So, I have been out for a minute. I was out doing had some things that I needed to do, doing some um had some other things that I was focused in on, but um I'm back. I have something on my lip. So anyway, welcome to Thursday Night Purpose Talk with me, Dr. Makiba. So y'all, tonight I just want to talk really quickly. It's not going to be longer than like 15-20 minutes is my goal, maybe even 20 minutes. My aim is to really stick to the 30 minutes or less, right? I don't want to be on here for a really long time. I know that the attention span of a lot of people, including myself, is not longer than like 30 minutes. Actually, it's like 20 minutes. So, anyway, welcome to Thursday Night Purpose Talk with me, Dr. Makiba. Tonight, y'all, we are going to be talking about God's protection and motivation. And the reason why I chose or selected this to talk about tonight is because as I was having my devotion time yesterday morning, um, and typically when I do have my devotion time and God he gives me a word or he speaks directly to me, there are times when I may share it out with other people. Not all the time when God gives me something does it necessarily mean that I'm going to share it out. Sometimes what God gives me is for me. But I do believe that there are times when God gives me something that to edify me is also can also be used to edify other people, right? Because what's used to edify one person can definitely be used to edify many people. And so I was in devotion yesterday, and as I was praying, as I was reading, as I was writing notes down and really taking in what the devotion was giving me and what the Lord was saying to me, I really felt like there was a need for me to share it out very briefly and to really talk about protection and motivation. And so, particularly focusing on the element of motivation, right? Because as individuals, um, even as we're moving towards purpose, as we accept the call or as we understand the call, right? Or we may not even understand the call. But as we are realizing that God has assigned us something to do, and we're moving into the place of what God has assigned for us to do, there are going to be days that you're just not going to be motivated. I don't know about you, but I know for me specifically and particularly, there are days that I'm not motivated to do what I know God has called me to do, what I know God has told me to do. I may not even know like the exact method, or I may not even know exactly what it all is going to look like or what it's all going to withstand, but I know that there's something that I'm supposed to be doing. And so when I get that revelation from God and maybe even start moving into the way of actually doing what He's called me to do, there are going to be times where I'm not going to be motivated, or there have been times that I'm not motivated to do what He's called me to do. And so that's really what kind of was the catalyst for this particular topic of what we're talking about tonight. Very briefly, it came from the devotion that I had on yesterday. And so what I want to just talk about really quickly is just understanding like God's protection and understanding that God is always in the mode of protecting us, right? There's no reason for us to fear when we go into that place of unmotivation, or when we go into that place where we don't have inspiration for what God has called us to. We always can remember that God is our refuge. And so when I was thinking about this yesterday as I was having my devotion, the Lord kind of spoke to me, and he helped me to understand that, Makiba, I am your refuge, right? When you get into these moments where you're not feeling like doing what I've called you to do, or when you get into these moments where you are feeling like, um, because you don't have the direction of what I'm calling you to do, um, you're going to want to quit, right? And so what I wrote down is the shield of God is my protection. God is always in the mode of protecting me from myself. And when I wrote that, basically how that transferred to me was that the devil will use me to sabotage me. And I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it again. The number one purpose of the devil in your life is to ensure that you do not fulfill the purpose that God has assigned over your life. That's the number one purpose of the enemy. The enemy doesn't have any other assignment. His assignment for you and me and everybody else who has a relationship with God or who calls ourselves children of God, the number one purpose of the enemy is to ensure that you or I do not fulfill the purpose of God over our life. He's going to use whatever method, whatever mode, whatever resource he can to ensure that we do not feel confident, to ensure that we do not feel secure, to ensure that we do not feel competent in anything, and not even realizing that when God has assigned us something to do, when God has assigned a task for us to do, God already knows what it's going to take for us to fulfill that task. It's not something that he assigned to us that we're not going to be able to fulfill. Now, in the moment of him assigning it, and in the moment of us actually realizing what he's calling us to do, or us maybe kind of idealizing what he is wanting us to do for him, we may feel that we don't have everything that it takes. And that's totally normal, right? Because God, the we know that God doesn't call people that are already equipped. Like if he called people who were already equipped, then that would completely negate the need for him in the whole in the whole big scheme of things. And so um what the Lord showed me in that devotion was that it's going to be normal for you to feel unmotivated, right? Because as individuals, as human beings, we typically get motivated by knowing what's next, or we get motivated by knowing that something is coming down the pipe, right? But when God gives us an initial word, that initial word may not have any frame of reference to it. And I'll use myself as an example. And I've said this before, this is just a reflection. But what I'm doing today in terms of like embracing what God has given me to do, with helping women, cultivating women, preparing women, helping women to realize their purpose call, or just even getting women in a place where they are comfortable and confident about what God is calling them to do. The Lord spoke that to me back in 2018. I didn't move into anything like this until 2023, last year. So the reason why I brought that up is because there are going to be times when God gives you a word. He will speak a word to you. You may be having quiet time with him. You may be having devotion time with him. You may be having quiet meditation time with him. And you receive these revelatory encounters from God that basically translate to God giving you a word about something that he wants you to do in the future. But you have no ability. You don't even know how it's going to happen. God is saying, he told me, and this is what I got through my devotion time yesterday, is it's totally okay to feel nervous. It's totally okay to feel unmotivated at times. It's even totally okay to feel uninspired at times. But he said the one thing that keeps you moving, even though you're unmotivated, and to keep you moving, even though you're uninspired, is to seek him and to settle yourself into him as a refuge of peace, as a refuge of protection. And I think that's sometimes really hard for us as human individuals because we are essentially relying on our relationship with God, even though we don't necessarily see God. And I've mentioned this before many, many times that for us and for anybody, trust is really difficult when you don't have something to relate it to. Or trust is really difficult when you don't have a relationship to lean into or to bend a little. And so when we have a difficult time trusting God, 99% of the time, it's because we haven't maximized or we haven't leveraged the relational effect that God allows for us to have with him. And so when you don't have a strong relationship with somebody, when you don't maximize the relationship that you do have with somebody, it makes it very difficult for you to trust that that person is going to come through for you in times where it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so what God is saying is it's totally okay. This is what he's saying to me. He said to me yesterday in devotion, this is what I am relaying to you today, is that in those times when you feel like you're not motivated to do what God has called you to do, in those times when you feel uninspired to do what God has called you to do, he literally said that's where you have to take heed to leaning into him and spending time with him and getting to know him more. Because in the revelation or the revelatory manifestation of his word and getting to know him is how you're going to start feeling comfortable, confident, motivated, inspired to do what he's called you to do. So, what I wrote here from my notes from yesterday when I had my devotion was I said, there are times when I or you may feel a lack of motivation, when the desire to keep going no longer exists. And then I asked the question, what do I do when that happens? So, you may have asked that question for yourself, like, what do I do when I know that God has called me to something, but I don't really know, but I'm not really feeling it and I'm not really feeling motivated to do it? What do I do when that happens? How do I course correct? Right? I know what God is calling me to do. I know that there's purpose assigned to me. I know that there's an assignment that God has called me to. I know that what I see right now in my life is not that it's not where it ends. I don't feel the tug and the pull with what I'm doing every day. I know that there is something that God is pulling me to that has more of an impact. Something that God is pulling me to that has more of a purpose. There's something that God is calling me to that makes me feel like I'm fulfilling something that brings me joy. There's something that God is calling me to that allows me to give him glory. There's something that God is calling me to, but I can't relay what it is. I don't know what it is, but I know that there's something else. So what do you do when God tells you to move into the direction of that thing that you feel like he's calling you to, but then you all of a sudden lose motivation, or you all of a sudden lose traction, or you lose inspiration? You don't feel like doing that. What do you do? How do you course correct that? How do you rediscover motivation that you know you need? How do you rediscover the passion? How do you rediscover the passion that is needed for you to fulfill the call of God over your life? How do you rediscover the momentum that is needed for you to live a life that's pleasing to God? How, right? Though these are legitimate questions that I've asked, And that I'm sure if you're honest, you've asked, right? How do you discover that? And so one of the things that I wrote was I need for God to show me how to make him my refuge. Because that's what it was about. It was about God being the refuge, God being my protection in times when I'm not motivated. Because I just got finished saying that the number one purpose of the enemy is to get you in the place that you're in right now. You didn't just happen to fall into a place of unmotivation. You didn't just happen to fall into a place of uninspiration. You didn't just fall into a place of not feeling like you wanted to do it. The enemy brought you there. Because the number one purpose of the enemy is to completely thwart the assignment of God over your life. And he's going to do whatever he can do to ensure that that is done. And what I said earlier was the enemy will use you to sabotage you. He doesn't have to bring other people into the picture. The enemy doesn't have to the enemy doesn't have to use your spouse to sabotage you. The enemy doesn't have to use your children. He will, but he doesn't have to because we are sometimes our biggest enemies. We're the ones that look into the mirror and say to ourselves, I can't do that. We're the ones that look at ourselves in the mirror and say, I don't think that I look good. We're the ones that look at ourselves, look at something that we do and say, I don't like the way that that looks. Or we may speak and say, I don't like the way my voice sounds. When God has given you a mandate to be an orator, to use your voice to grow the kingdom of God. But the first thing that you will do when you hear your voice is say, I don't like the way I sound. And so if you don't like the way you sound, you're not going to use your voice for the glory of God, which is why he gave you the voice in the first place. But the enemy knows that. The enemy knows things about you that you don't know. The enemy knows, I said this in a video of maybe last week sometimes, the enemy knows your fears. The enemy knows your weaknesses. The enemy knows what you struggle with. How does he know that? He knows that because 99% of the time he's heard you say it. He's heard you speak it. The enemy doesn't necessarily know things that are intrinsically intrinsically placed within you because he doesn't have that kind of God power. Right? God is the one that knows the heart. The enemy doesn't know that kind of stuff. What the enemy has privy to is what you speak. Right? So anytime you open your mouth and you start speaking negatively about yourself, or you start anytime you start, so here's the thing, and this is a very thin line because obviously in therapy, it's talk therapy, right? So in therapy, we talk. And in therapy, we openly voice some of the things that we fear, right? So I don't want people to hear this and think, oh, I have to really be careful what I say because I don't want the enemy to take it and use it against me. I don't want you to take that away from this because what I'm also going to say is the things that you do talk like that in open form, you have to cover with prayer. You have to cover with something positive that the Lord has spoken to you. Right? If you're going to say something negative about yourself, right, in a way, in a safe space with a therapist, or in a safe space with someone who can walk you through that and talk you through that, then the follow-up thing to that is you have to then cover that with something that the Lord has spoken to you that now overrides the negative thing that you feel about yourself. Right? And the more that we speak things that God has said about us, the more positive affirmations that are from the Bible, not necessarily from what we have created in our head, because there are affirmations that we can create in our head that will take us a long time to believe because in actuality, they're not necessarily true yet. Right? But when you take things directly from, you can create an entire list of affirmations taken from the Bible. Right? Things that God has said about you, things that the Lord has spoken about you, that you can write on a piece of paper and you can make those your purposeful affirmations, not personal affirmations, but your purposeful affirmations. Those purposeful affirmations that the Lord has spoken to you, like things like you are fearfully and you are wonderfully made, you are the head and you are not the tail, you shall live and you shall not die, meaning this thing that you are walking through right now is not going to be the end of it for you. So you can take those things, you can study the scriptures, and you can pull out purposeful affirmations that you can speak over yourself or that you can use to cover, right, cover those things that you feel are negative about you. But I want you to always remember that the enemy's number one job is to redirect your attention away from what God has called you to do. And that's where that unmotivation piece comes in. And that's where that uninspiration piece comes in. And that's where that I don't feel like I'm good enough thought process comes from. And that's where that I'm not competent enough to do something like that. That's where that thought process starts coming from, because the enemy knows your weaknesses, and he knows your fears, and he knows that you're afraid to do something. He knows that certain things are not within your comfort zone, right? And so if the Lord is pushing you out of your comfort zone to do something, but the enemy is making you feel, using your own voice. This is what I mean when I say that the enemy will use you to sabotage you, right? Utilizing your own voice, the enemy will have you believing your own voice, right? And so you have to be really careful about that. So when I ask those questions, I followed it up with, Lord, show me how to make you my refuge. Show me what that looks like. What does that look like? And the first thing that I wrote down was spending time with God and feeling liberated to pour out to him. Spending time with God and feeling liberated to pour out to him. Releasing all inhibition before him. Letting go of ego. Being free with him. So one of the things that we all know is that God, and here, God can't, right? We know that God can do anything, but I'm still going to say it this way. God can't heal you if you're not okay with being open and honest with him. Because essentially, when you're being open and honest with God, you're not necessarily being open and honest with God because God already knows. You're actually being open and honest with yourself so that you're opening yourself up for healing. The more that you keep things locked on the inside of you, or you try to come to God with this false reality, or you try to come to God with something I call a fallacious persona, it hinders God from being able to release healing to you because you haven't placed yourself in a position to actually receive healing. Because you're not being honest. You're not being honest with yourself. And so one of the ways that God allows you to make him your refuge is by you being aware enough. That's one of my favorite words, awareness. But by you being aware enough to spend time with him. Figure out what that means, right? Because spending time with God is subjective, right? The Bible speaks about what it looks like to spend time with God, but how we perceive that and how we translate that over to our own understanding is subjective. So the first thing you have to do is you have to figure out what it looks like for you to actually spend time with God. One of the ways that I personally spend time with God is when I get to work in the morning, I take a few minutes to actually do a devotion, and I spend time with God with that. On my way to work, I'll spend time praying to God. Sometimes it takes me an hour to get to work in the morning if I'm driving. Sometimes I'll be praying to God for 45 minutes straight. So that's a way that I spend, because the way that I spend time with God is subjective to how I spend time with God. God isn't going to reject how I choose to spend time with him as long as I'm genuinely choosing to spend time with him. And that's the same for you. You have to understand and identify what spending time with God looks like based on your own subjectivity. So you want to be aware with what spending time with God looks like. And then once you start spending time with God, you have to be liberated enough to pour out to him things that are concerning you, things that you're dealing with. And understand and know that God already knows what you're dealing with. He already knows what's concerning you. He's waiting for you to actually divulge it to him, right? And sometimes we're not truthful with God. Sometimes we present ourselves with half truths to God. And it doesn't help us at all because, as I mentioned 100 times before, God already knows what's going on with you. Just because you choose not to openly communicate it to him doesn't mean that he doesn't already know. So the only person that you're hurting when you opt to not be honest with God is yourself. Because, in my opinion, you're essentially inhibiting his ability to bring healing to you and to bring freedom to you. And when you're locked into this false truth, this false sense of truth that you present to God, and you cause him to not be able to heal you the way that he needs to heal you or the way that you need to be healed, you're essentially still locked in bondage and you're not free. And God is all about freedom, right? He's all about freedom. He wants us to be free to fulfill purpose. How are you going to successfully fulfill the assignment that God has assigned to your life if you are still living in bondage, in the bondage of unforgiveness, in the bondage of personal unforgiveness, in the bondage of living a lie, in the bondage of putting on airs, right? Putting on airs with people, making yourself look like something for someone else because you don't want to live in your truth, right? These are things that causes a person, and if you don't believe me, let's take it from this spiritual example to an actual physical example. You already know that when people hold unforgiveness, it causes them to be stressed out and sick, right? And if you were to talk to a medical practitioners would actually communicate to you and let you know that stress is a killer, right? Holding in hatred, holding in unforgiveness and whatever it looks like, because unforgiveness is a word, but it can be manifested through a number of different ways in your body. Like unforgiveness translates to hatred, unforgiveness translates to anger, unforgiveness translates to malice, a forethought, right? Can you tell? I look at a lot of like detective shows, but that's where I got the word malice, a forethought from. But that's unforgiveness, right? And so that kind of stuff can kill you or it can cause you to kill. And so you have to and then the other thing that's also really important is becoming aware of whether or not you've actually forgiven yourself for whatever part you played in that whole scenario. And that was one thing that I talked about in the very first book that I wrote. I talked about unforgiveness because it was very difficult for me to forgive myself with some things that I actually allowed in my first marriage and in some of my friendships. Um, I had a really hard time because one thing that personal forgiveness makes you see is it makes you see, um, how can I say this? So personal, when you are aware of the need for personal forgiveness makes you see that there was something that you did or you allowed or you knew or you contributed, right? So you're forgiving yourself. Even if you're forgiving yourself for something that wasn't even like bad, right? I didn't know that certain things were going on. But maybe I needed to forgive myself because I allowed a certain behavior that contributed to the activity that did A, B, C, and D, right? Personal forgiveness is something that will cause regret. It'll cause a whole host of internal emotions and internal issues within somebody's body that equally causes personal health issues, emotional health issues, mental health issues, financial health issues, spiritual health issues. And I add spiritual health issues on there as a solidifier because a lot of times we are not able to walk into what God has for us because we can't get past the reality of the stuff that we've actually gone through, or the stuff that we've allowed to happen in our lives, or the stuff that we've been victims of in our lives. And so we don't see ourselves as being worthy to represent God in the kingdom. I've lived that too. Like everything that I mentioned to you, I've lived to some degree in my life, right? And so I feel qualified to tell you about that because it's literally something that I've had to walk myself through. The other thing that I wanted to say really quick before I end this, because I'm at 31 minutes and I want to be done very quickly. The other thing that I want to remind you of is in here. Let me find it in my notes. So hold on. Oh, so when we start feeling like we're distant from God, when we start feeling like we're unmotivated, when God has given us an order, He's given us an assignment, He's given us a purpose call, right? A purpose assignment, but we don't feel like we know what we're supposed to be doing. We just know that I feel like I'm supposed to be doing this, but I don't really understand how I'm supposed to be going about doing this. So I'm just not going to do anything. We already know when people don't know how to do something, they don't do anything at all, right? God told me back in 2018, this has been my testimony since I came to this epiphany back in the summer of 2023, last year. This has been my testimony, and I will forever say this to anybody who wants to listen. When the Lord gave me the thumbs up, the go ahead to move to what He had purposed me to do, what He had called me to do, back in 2018, right after moving here to Chicago, He told me what my assignment was. And I said to Him, God, I don't know how to do that. And I was 100% genuinely serious. I had no idea. Like God had told me, I heard it just as clear as day. God told me what my purpose was, and He told me what He was going to have me doing. And I had no idea how to move that forward. And I told Him, I said, God, I don't know how to do that. And the Lord said to me, He said, the how will be your interpretation once you get more knowledge of me. And I said, okay. And that was that. It wasn't until the summer of 2023, last year, where I had a revelatory encounter with God after a 21-day fast, and then half of a 21-day fast. So right about day 11 or day 12, when the Lord started speaking to me. So I had been fasting for about 33 days. And I had this revelatory encounter with God. And God finally released me to move into the space that I am slowly and gradually moving into now. I realized at that time what He meant when He said, the how will be your interpretation as you receive more knowledge of me. Because you are not going to be able to do anything that God has purposed you to do in your life if you do not know clearly who God is. You cannot move into the things of God if you don't have a clear understanding of who God is, the origin of Him, the origin of purpose, the origin of what He's saying to you, where that comes from. You have to know God more. And here is the clincher. A lot of times we don't get to know God. We don't get the knowledge that we need of God without going through processes. And so I always say the word that God speaks to you and the word of God manifested in your life is going to include an interim of processing. And that processing can be very scary. And that, for a lot of people, that processing interim, that's where a lot of people fall off. They don't make it to the manifestation of the promise of God because they held on to the word spoken and they expected for it to be manifested immediately, and they were not mentally prepared to be processed by God. God is never going to put you on the front lines to do purpose for Him without Him making sure that you are ready. And the ready, it's like a soldier. You don't just join the military and then go to war. You have to go to basic training. You have to get prepared. You have to go through a process of preparedness. And the prepared process of God sometimes looks like trouble. Sometimes it looks like disease. Sometimes it looks like divorce. Sometimes it looks like sicknesses. Sometimes it looks like being alone. Sometimes it looks like loneliness. It's going to look like a number of different things because God is trying to get you to know Him, to know who He is, to know how He operates, to know how He functions, to know how He moves, so that when He puts you on the front line to do what He called, because remember, y'all, the purpose of our life is to pick up the finished work of God, of Jesus. To pick up the finished work of Jesus, our purpose, regardless of how we intend on manifesting it, right? Regardless of the method or the mode that we choose to do it, our purpose is solid. That is to pick up the finished work of Christ. That means to be disciples in the earth. That means to point as many people to God as we can. How we do that is going to be different because we all have gifts. We all have interests. We all have specific things that God has given us. But at the end of the day, our purposes look the same. Our purposes, I need you to get that. My purpose is no different from your purpose. Our purpose on earth is to pick up the finished work of Christ and disciple people to heaven until we go. How we do it is different. How we do it is different. And so that's why back in 2018, the Lord said to me, the how is going to be your interpretation, Makiba. I don't care how you do it. That's what He told me. And I believe Him now. I don't care how you do it. That's not important to me. The how isn't important to me. What's important to me is that when you do it, you solid. And the only way you're going to be solid is if you know me. Is if you know me. Is if I put you through fire. Is if I process you. And at the end of that processing, you're still with me. And you still understand me. And you still trust me. And you still believe me. But not the same way you did when you went in. So the person that you see sitting here today is not the person that got the word in 2018. Trust. I have gone through a number of things over the last 5.5 years living here in Chicago. Everything started making sense to me. God couldn't have done this to me leaving me in Florida. I was too comfortable in Florida. Florida was my comfort zone. That's where my family was. That's where my friends were. So God had to uproot me and He had to move me to a place where I knew nobody. He had to move me to an environment that was toxic. And by toxic, I mean the elements outside is toxic, so that my body could be shifted, so that I can go through sickness. Right? He had to pull me away from friends so I can be here lonely. Lonely. There were times when I was lonely, I was depressed. I wanted to go back home because I didn't feel it. God was processing me because He wanted to make sure that when He put me on the front line to fulfill the assignment that He spoke to me previously, that I was going to be ready. Am I 100% ready now? No, I'm still being processed, but I was processed enough for Him in 2023 to say, go forth. That was the revelatory encounter that I got from God last summer. And that's why I started moving in this space. For years, I chased doing things that were not what God had purposed me to do. It was not the method that God wanted me to use to do what He called me to do. And so God had to put me in a completely different space. He had to take me through my own individual processes in order for me to get it. And that's the same thing that he's doing with you. That's the same thing he's going to do with you. The saying is, many are called, but only few are chosen. Being chosen, I heard this the other day, and oh my God, this thing shook me. Being chosen is exclusivity. Because there are many people who are called to do things, and many people die not having done them. Why? Because they failed the processing test. The processing test was too much for them. Or they weren't sensitive to the voice of God to get more knowledge of him. Many are called, but only few are chosen, because only few are sensitive enough to understand what God is taking them through. Only a few people are sensitive enough, are trusting enough to God to follow him on this journey. Only a few are okay enough to say, not my will, but your will. Only a few. That's why the world is overwhelmed with people who are satisfying their own senses. And I got caught up in that for a long time. I was following this person on Instagram, following that person on Instagram. I was paying this amount of money for work with somebody, paying this amount of money to work with somebody. I was trying to create something based on the standard of the world. And God said, no, that's not what I called you to. That's not the method that I need you to use to fulfill my purpose, because that's not what I called you for. And that's why we have a world that is overwhelmed with people who are motivated by their own senses. They're motivated by satiating their own senses. And that's why many are called. I'm not saying those people aren't called. They may be called, but they're not chosen because they're not following the way of God. And it's very important that you get that. So those are some of the reasons why we become unmotivated, because we're following the wrong framework. We're following the wrong framework. And after a while, it gets hard. I've always adopted the premise of what God has called you to do is not going to be hard. But if anything is coming super hard to you, that's because it's not what God's called you to do. He's not hard like that. If he's called you to do something, he's going to bring it with ease. So spending time with God and feeling liberated to pour out to him, release all your inhibitions, let go of your ego, be open with God. Number 2, allow God to heal your hurt. Be truthful with God because he knows already. If you're hurting, stop trying to hold it in. God already knows that you're hurt, but he can't heal you because you haven't come to terms that you're hurt. You keep trying to put on airs. You're trying to put on this fallacious front. God can't do nothing with that. Part of healing is being honest and allowing for the release. Part of healing is being honest and then allowing yourself to release to God. Yes, God will use therapists. I'm a huge advocate for therapists. Therapists don't bring the healing, though. Therapists give you the tools. The healing comes from God. Talk therapy is healing because it is a release. Therapy is only going to work when you release. And when you release truth, not when you release false truths. Remember that God encourages and he welcomes the release. He wants you to release to him. He wants you to talk to him. He wants you to what's the word I'm looking for? He wants you to confess. He wants you to confess. When you're half truthful with God, you block the flow of healing. Something else that God gave me. When you're half truthful with him, you block the flow of the healing that he can give you. It's impossible for God to heal your hurt when you confess half truths or untruths, because part of his ability to heal you is contingent upon your ability to release to him. Your release is the first layer to your healing. This is all still connected to being unmotivated. This is all still connected to be uninspired when God gives you a word that's attached to your life. This is the reason why God has given me this desire to build this platform of holistic wellness. Not just holistic wellness so that you can be a whole healed person, but holistic wellness so that you can be healed and whole to fulfill purpose. Because don't think that your mental wellness and your spiritual wellness are not dependent upon one another. They are. You are not going to be spiritually well successfully if you're not mentally well successfully. You're not. You're not even going to be physically well successfully if you're not mentally well successfully. All of it is connected. So this is why forgiveness is so necessary when a person is seeking to be healed. When you hold back forgiveness, you are prohibiting your healing. Forgiveness paves the way to personal, emotional, and mental freedom. And at the end of the day, God is all about getting you free. Getting you free. Do me a favor tonight before you go to bed. Pick up your Bible, look up a scripture that has the word free in it. Look up a scripture that has the word free in it and meditate on that scripture. Because the Lord wants you to be free. You cannot be successful in your purposeful fulfillment if you're not free, if you're bound. The enemy will grab a hold of that man and he will run with that. It's like a dog that smells blood. If a dog smells blood, if a dog smells fear, he's coming after you. If the enemy smells fear on you, if he knows that he's gonna grab that, he's gonna run with that. And then you're gonna be in so deep that you can't get out. The Lord wants you to be free. Okay? So I'm gonna end this, but I'm gonna end it with the scripture that I want to leave you with. It was a scripture from my devotion yesterday. It's Psalm 62:8, but I'm going to give you Psalm 62:7-8. Psalm 62:7-8. Verse 7 says, "It is God who has kept me safe, and he has made me great. He is the strong place where I can hide and where I can be safe." Verse 8 says, "Yes, my friends, you should always trust in God. Tell him about all the troubles in your thoughts. God is our safe place to hide." Selah. God is your refuge. He is your refuge in the middle of your unmotivation. He is your refuge in the middle of your uninspiration. He is your refuge in ways that you don't understand what's going on. That is the first step to you course correcting and moving yourself out of that space and allowing yourself to be in a space where God can completely and totally heal you through his protection. So clearly, I went over 30 minutes. Y'all pray for me because I just can't. Like, I'm a teacher by trade. And I just keep talking what God gives to me. I don't know how to cut stuff off, but I really have to learn how to bring it. This is supposed to be a 30-minute live, and I'm trying to get to where I do 20 to 30-minute lives. I don't want to do hour-long lives, but I just had so much stuff, and God just kept giving me stuff to get to you. So we're at 50 minutes right now, and I'm going to go ahead and close it out. But thank you all so much for being here. I haven't even been looking at the comments, so I don't really even know. Let me see. Oh wow. I didn't even have the comments up. I'm sorry. Oh wow. Well, thank you all so much for being on here with me. And Thursday, every Thursday, I have been out for a few weeks, but every Thursday, 8 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. I do Purpose Talk with Dr. Makiba. So please join me here. We're gonna try to keep it 20, 30 minutes, but I can't promise you nothing because I'm a talker. I'm a talker. I like to talk, but I also like to edify and I like to educate. So please meet me here next Thursdays, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time for another episode of Purpose Talk. See you later.